So it's good to be with you. My name is Rick Stravers, and I live in Kalamazoo, which I just discovered on Google is exactly, now I can't remember, 37 miles from here, because I had to report my mileage to Ivan. And I'm a member in Kalamazoo of St. Martin de Tours Church there. I've been there a member a long time. Between the services, I got a chance to poke around here a little bit. What a beautiful church you have. These stunning windows. I love the beautiful music. We heard a superb prelude at the beginning of this service. So beautiful. And I discovered the gardens when I was poking around. I think those gardens were a personal gift to me. Just to discover those beautiful things out there. Evening primrose out there, I think. Oh, beautiful. So, kudos to all of you for a beautiful place to worship. And people help me out because I'm new here and don't quite know the drill. As I hope you won't have too many chances to experience. I hope to braid myself into this drill at least a little bit. But people have been very helpful this morning, so I'm grateful for that too. So, it's good to be here together to remember the day of Pentecost. And not only to remember it, but to explore and embrace the continuing, ongoing reality of Pentecost. The first thing that caught my attention when I started studying for today, first thing that caught my attention in the lessons comes at the very end of today's gospel reading. Jesus says to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." And when I read that, my heart was troubled. Not by that, but it came to me in a troubled time. It speaks to me because I've been quite troubled these past few weeks about the things that have been happening in our country. I felt really shook about the shootings in Buffalo, New York, black men and women just doing their shopping at a neighborhood grocery store, and a young white man evidently had been seduced by the lies of white supremacist propaganda, and he kills innocent people who are there buying a birthday cake for a grandson, a deacon helping people in his church get groceries who can't drive to the store. It's horrible. And then 10 days later, we went through it all again. Another young man, this time in Texas, and he kills those beautiful children in the 4th grade at Robb Elementary, 10-year-olds. Just 2 weeks ago, I drove to Ann Arbor to be with my daughter, one of my daughters and her family, and her youngest turned 10. Her name is Piper Ann. Same age as these kids. And all of that came on top of stuff that I was already feeling kind of disturbed about. Troubled by watching the violence, the invasion of Ukraine for no reason and destroying a country. And I'm worried about climate change and what that's going to mean. And so you all have your own stuff. But so here I am with these worries, feeling like life is a troubling place. My heart is troubled. And then I read this and Jesus says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled." And I realized, well, Rick, I guess he's talking to you. And maybe he's talking to you all who are troubled. We often hear what Jesus says with a kind of judgment, as if it's a judgment. But when he says, "Don't be troubled, don't be afraid," I don't think he's criticizing us or scolding us. I don't think he's trying to add a feeling of feeling guilty on top of our feeling troubled and bothered by bad things in the world. Jesus knows things can be very troubling, and he himself was very troubled. When his friend Lazarus died, he was troubled. I think what he's doing here is reminding his disciples and us, his disciples here in Marshall, that there's a reality bigger than the trouble in our hearts, deeper than that trouble. Like a framework. There's a reality that's a framework for us. And that framework is the presence of God, the reality of a profound peace and of an ultimate healing goodness that comes from God. And so I started hearing his words for my troubled heart, not as a criticism, but as a reminder, an invitation to recognize that even in the midst of troubling things, we can be sustained by the reality of the Spirit of God, who is about wisdom and love, and who abides with us and abides in us. At the very beginning of today's gospel, a man named Philip, he's a disciple of Jesus, asked Jesus a question. And it's an evocative question. He asked Jesus to show him and the other disciples God the Father so that they can be satisfied and be at peace. He says, "Show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. We'll have what we need." I have loved that he says that for many, many years. Show us God, and we'll be happy. But this week, when I was living with this, I realized Jesus' response is a little he's disappointed a little bit. He says, "Philip, what you need to see to be satisfied, it's already here. It's all around you. It's in me, standing right in front of you," Jesus says. God dwells in me, Jesus says. God dwells in you. You're seeking God, but don't be so committed to seeking God that you define God as being somewhere where you aren't, far away, unreachable. God's not somewhere far away. God's right here, Jesus says to Philip. Right here. In your current life, as it is right now, however it is. So I can relate to Philip. He sees himself somehow as living in the absence of God. If only I could see God, he says. But Jesus says, no, that's not true. And some part of us knows that's not true. As I read it and lived with that in preparation for our worship today, I realized, well, I know that's not true. And yet I can relate to what Philip says. But some part of us does know that God is with us. And then in the second lesson, St. Paul keeps working this same idea. St. Paul says, this very longing for God that we feel, that itself is a sign of God's presence in us. Wow. Paul says, when we cry out to God, Abba, Father, that shows we already know we've been adopted in as God's children. So because even the longing for God arises in us, that longing even is a precise indicator that the Spirit of God is with us and in us. And then I spent time with our psalm today. Sometimes the lessons don't seem to me to have anything to do with each other, but today's not one of those days. in the psalm, the psalmist, this is way like 500 to 1,000 years before Jesus and Philip and St. Paul. The psalmist is writing this psalm filled with the joy of realizing that everything that is, every creature, every person has existence by the breath of God. So the psalmist looks around, like I looked around at the garden a few minutes ago, and said, all of this alive by the goodness of God. And so much incredible diversity in the world and in nature. The psalmist says, "O God, how manifold are your works." I realized this week that doesn't just mean there's a lot of them. It means they are full of variety. Your works are not uniform and boring. They're unbelievably different and diverse. It turns out our world is a splendor of diversity, and that in itself is an expression of the goodness of God. And then that's what the Pentecost story is all about. God's wisdom and love overflow in diversity, in people from all over the world. It's a diverse crowd there in Jerusalem, which was an international city. They come from all kinds of places, Jews and Arabs, and it's still like that, all kinds of people, all kinds of places, Ethiopians. I thought as I got ready for today, it's kind of like going to JFK or Amsterdam or De Gaulle in Paris. It's an incredible cosmopolitan experience with people speaking more languages than you can imagine. So this crowd in Jerusalem is busting with diversity, and then they hear the word of God, each of them in their own language. The crowd is rich, overflowing with the goodness of God. So in this story, uniformity doesn't seem to be the goal. Just like in the psalm, it's not uniformity. The goodness of God creates diversity, and diversity is no barrier to the good news of God. God's goodness is not expressed in uniformity so much as in diversity here. A rich, multifaceted, miraculous, thrilling diversity. The next time somebody bugs me, I'm going to try to remember that. The good news of God's presence, the good news of the breath of God, God's Spirit touching each person, however different they are, in their own language. What a thing that is. They don't need a translator because the good news comes to them in the language of their own hearts. And that's good news for us, too. About 40 years ago, I was struggling with both a sense of calling and a sense of desire to become a priest. And yet, I had a lot of doubt and sort of reluctance about the whole thing. And one of my life issues is, do I fit? And I went and talked to Joe Nyman, who was the priest in Paw Paw at the time. And he said to me, "Rick, do you know the Pentecost story? You don't have to hear the gospel in somebody else's language. Your job is to hear it in your own language." Joe has died now, but he's still teaching me with that comment. The good news of God's life comes to us, comes to you, not in my language, but in the intimate language of your own heart. We don't have to try to hear God's good news in other people's languages. We can hear God's good news in the language of our own hearts. The great Japanese Zen Buddhist teacher Eihei Dogen, who founded major lineage of Zen Buddhism. He died in 1053 in Japan. He says it like this. I love how he says it, so I want to include it today. Here is the place. Here the way unfolds. So all the creatures around us, all the people around us, and we ourselves, whoever we are, all of us are expressions of the good news of the life-giving Spirit of God. And when our hearts are troubled, as they may be right now today, Jesus, I think, here is inviting us to come home. Come home to our heart of hearts with our trouble. So when our hearts are troubled, we come home and recognize the peace of the presence of Christ right here, right now, in our life in difficult times. We are invited by him to come home and experience the loving and wise and undefeated Spirit of Christ within us. And that, I think, is good news that we can celebrate together this morning by doing Eucharist together. Amen.